welcome, good evening. On behalf of the Royal Geographical Society with IBG even, I'm Martine Croxall. I'm a presenter with the BBC News channel and also a fellow of the Society, very proudly. The reason for that is I did a geography degree a very long time ago at the University of Leeds. Just to say that if the fire alarm goes, it's real, or we have to assume it's real. And it has happened before, and we all pile out and have a chat outside, and then hopefully come back in. But fingers crossed. Now, we know so much these days about Mount Everest, but when the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club expeditions took place in the 1920s, it was a very different matter. In the words of George Mallory, the early explorers walked off the map just to find the mountain. The Society's new exhibition outside, which I hope that you will have had a chance to look at in the pavilion, marks the centenary of these Everest expeditions. It looks at how Captain John Knowles' films shaped the popular image of the mountain, while sometimes obscuring the role of local intermediaries. Some uncomfortable and complex social, racial, and geopolitical dynamics shaped those expeditions, and that legacy can still be felt today, and we will be addressing a lot of that this evening. The 100th anniversary of these expeditions gives us an opportunity then to reflect on the role, the importance of local knowledge, labour, and resources that facilitated those early expeditions and climbs, and also how those expeditions were documented and recorded. We're joined tonight by three experts. Professor Felix Driver, to my far left, is a historical geographer at Royal Holloway, University of London. He specialises in collections-based research and public engagement in the arts and humanities. He has a particular interest in the history of exploration and the Royal Geographical Society, and he's part of the Society's Collections Advisory Group. There is a huge collection here. It's of some 2 million artefacts, about 1 million of which are maps, and most of them don't see the light of day, so we'll talk about what we'd like to see aired a little bit more often later. Jonathan Westaway is a senior research fellow in history in the School of Humanities, Languages and Global Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. He specialises in the history of mountaineering, mountain environments, and imperial cultures of exploration. He takes a strong interdisciplinary approach, drawing on insights from cultural geography and anthropology. And Atem Lemtur is a PhD student at Göttingen University in Germany. Her research focuses on the Himalayan mountaineering expeditions and the local porters who were recruited in the early 20th century. The archive of the German Alpine Club has been central to Atem's work. It'll be interesting to hear the difference between the German approach and the British one. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much for being here. In a moment, we'll hear from each of our panellists in turn, followed by group discussion, and then our audience here, and if you're watching online as well, do feel free to think of some questions. If you're watching online, you can post them in the chat function, and we'll have 15, 20 minutes at the end to take your questions. And usually the audiences here come up with some absolute crackers that I wish I had thought of. So let's start. Felix, if you'd like to take your introductory strict 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Martine. I'm going to talk about the collections. That is my interest, as you've heard. And there are some remarkable collections here. For quite a long time now, there's been an interest in the histories that are hidden in collections like this, particularly the histories of labour and employment, including on Everest expedition. So there are some wonderful archives here relating to employment, and there you can see families receiving payment and giving their thumbprints to acknowledge that. We have outside an exhibition at the moment, Everest Through the Lens, using these collections. It's extraordinarily interesting exhibition. They're based on the collections. Everest Through the Lens. Whose lens? Well, as we've heard, Captain John Knowles, who made this extraordinary film in 1922 and another one in 1924. And you can see him there in this picture. Now, what's interesting is in the archives here, there are letters and correspondence and papers as well as photographs. And there is a particular letter by John Knowles to Arthur Hinks, the secretary of the RGS, in June 1922, making it very clear that he saw this photograph as a means of promoting the expedition and then raising funds for the next expedition. So in other words, from the very origin of this very famous image that you're looking at, it was thought of as a marketing opportunity for expeditions from the start. Now, if you see this image on a little bit larger scale, you may be able to see now more clearly that there's not one but two figures in this image. A Sherpa holding the tripod steady at 23,000 feet in these extraordinary circumstances. So the Sherpa is there in the image, but he's usually not seen. He's in the shadows, as it were. Another question raised by this image is who took it. It's usually attributed to John Knoll, which is possible. It could have been triggered remotely, but I don't think it was. Why do I say that? Because we have an interesting archive which contains an absence, and that's the name of the photographer here. So this is an exhibition held in the Alpine Club early in 1923 of the photographs from the first or the second expedition in 1922 to raise money, and all the photographs are listed. They're all attributed to one of the climbers, apart from this one. No initials there. I think that tells us fairly conclusively that it wasn't Knoll who took the photograph, and in all likelihood, it was one of his porters. Here they are, 8 of them, along with another porter who's looking after the mule here, and in front of them, the camera. You might make out the telephoto lens in the bag there. There are lots of things you can do with these kinds of archives, these kinds of images. This is another set of photographs from 1936, which I've talked about before. It's a set of photos taken in Darjeeling at the moment when the porters are being recruited. And it's an extraordinarily interesting set of images. You can identify individuals in these images. Here is Karma Paul, the interpreter on the expedition, and here is a young Tenzing Norgay, half his age. Tenzing Norgay is 21 at this time in 1936, and you all know that he went on to climb Everest in 1953. A lot can be done with these kinds of images, and in this case, we're looking at an exhibition where the image has been vastly expanded to almost human scale, as you can see by Rita Gardner here for scale, against the Sherpas on the back wall of the pavilion gallery. So exhibitions like the one outside can do active things with these collections and can help change our understanding of the history. There's lots of individuals in the collections which, when we know their names and we know their roles, we can say a lot more about, including interpreters especially, but also in this case a botanist from Sikkim, a plant collector. We can trace life stories through these archives. This is Karma Paul. These are some of the dozens of photographs of Karma Paul, the interpreter, from 1922 to 1938. Really fascinating set of images in the archives, all of which have been digitized now, and you can see in the collections. We can also use the collections to shed light on some episodes and events in expeditions, most famously avalanches and the disaster in 1922, which killed 7 porters, although, as you notice, the Times reported that the climbers had a narrow escape. And in the collections, we can locate the avalanche, actually. We can work out when the photographs were taken around it, some of them half an hour before the avalanche took place. We can identify the very spot where the avalanche actually happened. We can go further to name the 7 porters who died, 7 of them Sherpa, 1 boatier, and we can say something about their lives, because this extraordinary compensation document that's in the exhibition talks about compensation to their families, where they lived. They lived in Nepal, they lived in Darjeeling, they lived in Tibet. So you get a sense of the diasporic community that the Sherpa were at this point. So I think collections like the one at the RGS can help us tell new stories about a very well-known history. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix. So fascinating, aren't they? It's wonderful to see just how many people were involved in these expeditions, and it's so easy to overlook that. Jonathan.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oops, we're on the wrong slide. There we go. So I'm currently leading a research project called Other Everests, Commemoration, Memory and Meaning, and the British Everest expedition centenaries. As you know, we're currently in the middle of this centenary period, and we're trying to bring together international scholars, archivists, curators, learned and professional societies like the RGS, the mountaineering community, to really critically assess the legacy of these Everest expeditions and to reevaluate the symbolic, political and cultural status of Everest in the contemporary world. To a certain extent, we're bringing new, fresh, historical and scholarly perspectives to bear on Everest mountaineering narratives, and kind of challenging us to broaden and deepen our understanding of its mountaineering history and its continuing symbolic legacy in the contemporary world. There are some very persistent late imperial kind of meta-narratives around his heroic masculinity, which is still very much attached to Everest. And as part of this research project, we're asking about those stories and how they were put together and what they left out, the kind of imperial omissions. And we're asking some critical questions. So whose history are we commemorating when we commemorate these expeditions? What are the sources for the history of indigenous high-altitude mountaineers and laborers, who Felix has shown us some photographs of? How do we incorporate Nepalese and Tibetan perspectives into our research? And how does history continue to shape contemporary globalized mountaineering cultures on Everest? I've been very lucky to have an RGS Wiley research fellowship this year, and I've also been doing this project as well, which is called Encountering the Indigenous Body in the Himalayan Borderlands. And it's very much looking at the construction of Gurkhas and Sherpas as both martial and mountain races. So this was part of a project in the British Empire, and it was part of a kind of racialized approach to the peoples of empire. So post-colonial critics of empire have long argued that the racial logic of constructing and co-opting certain racial groups to the project of empire was central to divide and rule policies of the colonizers. So I've been particularly looking at the early Everest expeditions and looking at how both Gurkhas and Sherpas were racialized and how they were applied to mountaineering in this context. And the research takes a micro-historical approach. I'm looking at Gurkha officers and NCOs who were part of these Everest expeditions in the 1920s and 1930s. Currently at the moment, in particular, this person, Captain Charles John Morris of the 3rd Gurkha Rifles, who was on Everest in 1922 and 1933. You may never have heard of him. That's not surprising at all. He was there because of his linguistic skills. He was a transport officer. He spoke Nepali, he spoke Gurung, he spoke Hindustani, he spoke a bit of Tibetan as well. So people like Morris were absolutely critical for managing labor on these expeditions. So when we want to research the early histories of these expeditions, it's really important, I think, to know who is doing the recording and what their perspectives are and what are their backgrounds. So my research is focused a lot on military and colonial officials. It's really important to, whilst we have fantastic resources here at the RGS, important archives are elsewhere in the world as well. So Morris's archives are currently at the University of Wyoming, so you have to do quite a bit of comparative work in multiple archives. And why is this important? Well, Morris, when he was on leave from the army in 1934, he was doing his anthropology degree at Cambridge, and he was lecturing at the Royal Anthropological Institution. And in 1934, he came back into the Royal Geographical Society, and he recorded biographical details about his friend Lewa, who'd been with him on the 1922 Everest expedition. And he created this mini biography, which says, here he was Principal Sirdar on the 1933 Mount Everest expedition. He was on Kamet in 1931. He'd been with Morris in 1922. And it's this kind of unique biographical material that is so important in helping us research these hidden histories of indigenous high-altitude workers who were, of course, often illiterate and unable to record their own stories. How am I doing for time?
I'll let you carry
Very briefly, very briefly. I said it's really important to know who is recording these stories. And Maurice went on to become the director of the BBC Third programme. He had a very eminent career subsequent to Everest. But in 1960, he wrote his biography, and he came out as gay. And he talked about his relationship he'd had with his Gurkha orderly and how important that was to him in his life. So my research is also focusing on these very intimate aspects of colonial life. Maurice was a great friend of E.M. Forster at Trinity as well in Cambridge. So that I would argue it's crucially important that we understand the lives of these, under-researched members of the Everest expeditions. And I better stop there, because I'm up to 5 minutes.
Very disciplined, thank you. Just throughout that, Atem was nodding vigorously with so much of what you said, so I'm sure you're going to pick up now on some of those themes that Jonathan's started talking about. Atem, thank you very much.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me here this evening. I'm really excited to share my research with all of you. So I work on the Himalayan expeditions in the interwar period with a focus on peaks in the eastern Himalayas and Nanga Parbat in the western Himalayas. And this particular slide, roughly plotted, shows you the kind of timeline that I'm looking at. Above are the Everest expeditions, and below are the expeditions from the German Alpine Association and the German Himalayan Foundation. And these expeditions overlap in terms of the method of climbing, and as well as the porters who were recruited for these expeditions. And I look into what the archives of these expeditions talk about them and the lives of these porters. I'd just like to point here another photograph by Maurice. He was a personal servant, and he died in 1934 when he was on an expedition to Nanga Parbat with the climber William Merkel. So this just shows the kind of overlaps of the expeditions. The early Everest expeditions were significant in selecting and organizing what they perceived were the best people to take them into the higher altitudes. And having organized and popularized the Sherpas, it opened up the possibilities for employment in other expeditions. So, however, we know that it was not only the Sherpas who made up the climbing auxiliary of the climbing Everest expeditions. There were also, as Jonathan had spoken about, the Gurkha non-commissioned officers, as well as people or persons specifically to repair shoes. So this indicates that it was not obviously the significance of having your boots repaired, but the handling of leather was a profession specific to particular castes in India, and the caste structure is then maintained in the expeditions itself. So in this slide, the description of the photograph is very interesting to me, as it indicates that a porter and servant are used interchangeably. However, both categories are distinct with their own responsibilities, status, and hierarchy. So it raises the question of when is a person considered a servant and when is he a porter. So however, being a servant also had advantages of patronage. And I would go to the picture that Jonathan had showed. This is again the same person, Lewa. The biography is inscribed there. And the Sirdar is considered to be the headman among all other porters, almost equivalent to what you would understand as a foreman among the porters. In the hierarchy, he is at the top, he would be paid more, and he would also have the power to discipline the porters. So for the communities that were mobilized for these expeditions, the mountains were seen as roots, resources, and the peaks were an abode of the gods. So the Everest expeditions give us the opportunity to look into this very entangled aspect of mountaineering history that opens up questions of seeing the mountain as a place of work or how in the expeditions different roles are collapsed. And more importantly, how did the potters enact their agency in the mountains? Thank you.
Thank you, Atem. Yeah. We might get to know some of these people quite well by the end of this, hopefully. Felix, start off, if you can, by just explaining to what extent were these expeditions a further expression of empire, and coming as they did, of course, only a few years after the end of World War I, which had been such a horrific experience for so many people.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, the first point about empire, we sometimes forget. I think the territorial extent of the empire grew in the interwar period. It retrospectively seems like late empire, but it may not have seemed that way at the time, particularly in India. So the imperial context for these expeditions, you just can't understand the expeditions without it. It would be like trying to understand Charles Darwin's voyage on the Beagle without taking into account that it was the Royal Navy that gave him a lift there. Now, of course, the Empire and the Navy don't determine what happens in expeditions, and of course they don't, but it is a necessary context to think about how expeditions are provisioned, how access is got, what the relationship is between what goes on in Calcutta and what goes on in Darjeeling, what goes on in Tibet, and that sort of political context that mountaineers know everything about, of course, is important. But empire goes further than that into the way that labor relations work or the way that attitudes to race work. So it seems to me absolutely essential as a context for understanding these early expeditions. And many of you will know the work of Wade Davis on the 1920s to pick up the point about the war and the significance of that, cataclysm for a generation, but also the significance of it for the formation of many of those, not all of them, who went into the first 2 or 3 British expeditions to Everest.
Jonathan, talk to us, if you would, about the construction of the idea of what it was to be a Sherpa. Where did that come from? Why was it useful, and to whom?
Well, it picks up really from what Felix has been talking about. I mean, Wade Davis's thesis about the impact of the First World War on all the members of the Everest expeditions, and that they were constructed as efforts to rebuild damaged masculinity and to reassert kind of imperial right to rule in British India, missed a really crucial point. And that was that there was active frontier warfare going on during these expeditions. And a lot of the early members of these expeditions were military officers, Gurkha officers, and a lot of those Gurkha regiments had been fighting from 1915, from the Dardanelles, but they then went into the Anglo-Afghan War in 1919. And then there was a massive uprising on the northwest frontier in India, and very, very nasty, hostile, savage border wars were going on until 1923. So John Morris, who we showed you photographs of, he's very explicit in his biography. He says he chose to go to Everest because he wanted to escape the border warfare in the northwest frontier in 1922, which fundamentally kind of repositions some of our arguments about why people go mountaineering and why people want to go to Everest. So to come to your question, I mean, in my research, I'm really looking at how, particularly Brigadier General Charles Bruce deployed Gurkhas in mountain warfare, and he applied these kind of racialized typologies to Nepali recruits in the Gurkha regiments, and he needed men for mountain warfare in the northwest frontier province against mainly Pathan groups. And so he developed this kind of mythos around the Gurkhas as perfectly suited to mountain warfare. He got Gurkha NCOs to come on mountaineering expeditions in India with him, and then with Martine Conway in Europe and things like this. And these same kind of racialized, kind of almost artificial ethnographies that the British were producing around race in India were then started to be applied, I think. I don't know what you think, Atem. To Sherpas as well, because many of these early personnel in 1921-22 were Gurkha officers, they were military officers, and they were looking for kind of labor forces that could work at altitude. So the same kind of approach to fashioning Gurkhas as uniquely adapted to mountain warfare was then applied to mountaineering on Everest.
It's like tiger. The idea of the tiger, these sort of animal analogies which keep cropping up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, the British, the cult of hunting in India, of shikar in India, was very, very strong. And actually, it was an imperial culture, you know, and hunting was very hierarchical. Only certain people could carry hunting weapons, mainly, you know, the British, and only certain people could shoot tigers. For instance, the tiger was the pinnacle of the colonial kind of hunting cult. So, you know, this kind of racialized profiling of subaltern races quite often used animal analogy in British India. So the Pathans were often described as wolves and, you know, leopards and kind of lower types of animal. And then the tiger was applied to things of very high value, I think. So, yeah.
What sort of resistance was there to these, creating these groups and the attribution of these animal characteristics? Was there a resistance from indigenous people?
In the expeditions itself, you do see outright resistance in the form of strikes or desertion sometimes. But there are also ways to read into the archives about very subversive kind of resistance itself. But I would just like to go back to Jonathan's point about the racialization. It also goes back into the mid-19th century, where you know, British India, when recruiting for the military, they developed this kind of system of recruiting from particular groups of people that they found suitable for warfare. And then they attributed these animalistic kind of attributes to these groups so that they could fight for them as well as control them. So there's a kind of tension between the two as well.
We've already heard Tibet, Nepal, India spoken of. So if we talk about Sherpas, I mean, how distinct a group are they? There must have been people from so many different places who we now think of as one separate group, and it's just not true.
I mean, so the Sherpas are an ethnic community coming from the Solukhumbu region of Nepal. And they were one of the groups that were migrating into India from the mid-19th century in search of employment opportunities. So, and then in Darjeeling is when they got kind of recruited into the expeditions. So there were many groups that were involved initially, but later on, there's a kind of what James Scott calls impression management within the expedition that made them more favorable to be recruited.
They were keen to be recruited?
They were keen to be recruited because within the labor economy of that particular region, being recruited into the expeditions provided them salary, clothing, food, at least for that season. And the wages were higher than what they would get paid if they stayed back in Darjeeling or in Solukhumbu.
So there was some slightly higher status to be had if you were part of the group.
Right.
Felix, how long had these expeditions in the 1920s been in the pipeline for? And to what extent were indigenous people included from the very beginning of those ideas?
Well, any large-scale expedition would require labor, and just as the army required Indian labor or Asian labor of various kinds, they would have been there from the first. But the process of learning about and attributing certain characteristics to different ethnic groups, as Jonathan has mentioned, is a gradual one. And there's a sort of sense in which the 1921 reconnaissance expedition, they're doing reconnaissance, and you can imagine what that is in survey and geography, very important work. But another thing they're learning about and trying to experiment with is, as it were, is the employment of different groups, and that's very explicit, isn't it, in the contemporary accounts. But what Atem is talking about is really important, that there is this historical context which is often economic. You know, the fact that the compensation records themselves, that process is borrowed from the army, of course. The compensation records refer for the 7 porters who died, refers to individuals whose families are living in Tibet, Nepal, the Khumbu Valley, and Darjeeling. Shows you that, as you said, Martine, it's a very complex geography, but at the same time, on top of that complex geography, you're getting imposed certain assumptions about, much more simple assumptions about ethnic groups and types. And I think that's the complex situation you have. But the economic context is really important because it does help to explain why there was demand for these kinds of roles and against alternative occupations, whether that's road building or working on plantations sometimes, or mainly in urban occupations that Sherpas would have been doing.
In attributing, Jonathan, different characteristics, different names to different groups, how handy was that to the colonial power in terms of control, divide and rule?
I mean, lots of people argue that that's exactly what it was designed to do. I mean, you have to remember that, in 1912, British India moved its capital from Calcutta to New Delhi. It did that partly to shift the kind of center of power away from Bengal, where there was lots of political opposition to British rule amongst Bengali intellectuals. And Delhi, and also the whole complexion of the British Army of India changed as well from the company army of the middle of the 19th century. By 1912, the British were recruiting more of these martial races, particularly Muslims, particularly Sikhs, and of course Gurkhas from Nepal as well. And you used those and the development of the idea of these military races was very much framed around divide and rule policies that actually, they had different martial attributes and they could be deployed in different parts of the Indian subcontinent to maintain British rule. So,
what sort of input did the indigenous populations have in the way they were organised? How much negotiation went on in terms of what they chose to do, how they chose to be deployed? I'm thinking about how much agency they actually had.
I would say in terms of controlling how much they could carry as well, the load, you would carry, say, like 50 pounds, I think. So they could kind of negotiate that once they were in the mountains, because verticality kinds of tips the power dynamic a little bit. So they use certain parts of the expedition to negotiate for better food sometimes, maybe more pay. Yeah.
And you said that they went on strike at times.
They did, yeah.
What form did that take? They literally just stopped work?
They would stop work, or the threat of desertion would be a major aspect, because without the porters in the mountains, the expedition couldn't go on. And I mean, not in the early expeditions, but later on in the 30s, you see more of these actions happening in the other expeditions as well.
What sort of punishment might there be, though? Was there punishment meted out?
There was a threat of violence in these expeditions as well, but I think the threat of not being employed for future expedition was also great among them. There was a system where, and this is how they copied from the Alpine system of having testimonials written about the Sherpas themselves. They were issued books where the testimonials from the climbers would be written. On the basis of that, they could get employment in other maybe treks or other mountain expeditions. So if you got a bad review,
TripAdvisor.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, was that purely the high altitude porters or climbers?
It was, just the high altitude ones. It was the Himalayan club that instituted the chit book.
Yeah. So what is a porter is a very interesting question that Atem is working on, and we're learning a lot from that work. But I mean, because porters, there are many different kinds of portering that go on, and different kinds of recruitment as well as the expeditions move in terms of local.
And there's a hierarchy in that, even in that as well. That was sort of stratified as well, was it?
I believe so. I mean, through the Sirdar system you talked about, but perhaps in other ways as well.
I mean, within, say, the climbing, the porters which were used in the higher altitudes, you would have the Sirdar, who's on top. You would have the under Sirdar, who's just below him. Then you would have the cooks, and then the runners for the cooks. And how do you enter this particular laboring contingent? Then sometimes you would enter it as a runner for the cook, or you would through family relations.
And you could get promoted?
You could get promoted. I mean, you could see, I think it was Lewa, he was a personal servant in 22, and 33 he becomes a Sirdar, and 34 he becomes a Sirdar for another expedition. And that's where you remain as a Sirdar. But that also prevents your employment in, say, off-season treks, because you were too expensive.
Oh, I see. You've priced yourself out of the market. Jonathan, how much do we know about how well the indigenous population were looked after when they were part of an expedition? Because, of course, we didn't know so much about the effects of high altitude on the human body, on what sort of acclimatization was required, because it now takes days and days, doesn't it, to acclimatize. Even going up to base camp, it takes you a bit of getting used to that.
Yeah, I'm sure my colleagues can probably say more about this than I can, but you know, there was still an enormous degree of kind of segregation in some of these expeditions. You know, it wasn't necessarily all equal, with everybody having the same level of provisioning and equipment. So I think, you know, we're talking about a colonial society. It was still very hierarchical. Or Felix, do you want to reflect on the...
Well, I was wondering about the physical effects. I think that was the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, was the oxygen sort of shared out equally, as it were, when they were right at doing those experiments with the oxygen?
No, that I don't know.
Oh, that would be interesting to find. Do you know about that, Atem?
I'm not sure about the sharing of oxygens, but I think the rations were also divided according to racial division. So there was a...
Based on what?
It's very arbitrary. We don't know on what basis, but maybe it was on previous military expeditions, I think.
Yeah. And cost and, you know, basic, you know, kind of implicit kind of racism as well, really. Yeah.
I mean, do we know very much about how safety was looked after? I mean, we were, you know, much better at assessing these things now than we would have been then, but it's notable that those who died in the avalanche of 1922 were Sherpas.
Well, the 22 avalanche was a disastrous event, not anticipated, clearly, and there's a big discussion to be had about that. But the climbers immediately afterwards blamed themselves, so Mallory blamed himself in letters and so on.
He was buried by the snow, but managed to get out. And
that's right.
A couple of other people managed to get out too.
That's right, but I think that was pure chance, actually. And at least that's what they said. I mean, I'm not talking about responsibility there. I'm just talking about, you know, what you suggested about how some of them died and some didn't. But overall, they went too late. The monsoon was coming on, and they really took a risk that they shouldn't have done. But on the other hand, they didn't know the terrain, and they were learning all the time. So I think in terms of that particular episode, it wasn't that the porters were bearing a risk. I mean, they just weren't aware of the risk, possibly at the time. But it wasn't unequal in that sense. They were all there together, and unfortunately the event affected some and not others.
How steep was the learning curve in terms of mapping the region? Because when they first got there, they had to be sure that they'd actually got the right mountain when they first got there, didn't they? Of course, they were working pretty blind. So during those 3 expeditions, the first one, which was exploration rather than with the intent to climb, they must have clocked up a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge very quickly.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's very clear, that it is. You could see it as one great experiment and one great learning opportunity, but they were very keen to get to the top. So there's a whole set of other reasons there that maybe are not scientific, essentially. But certainly the reconnaissance expedition is gaining a lot of knowledge and expertise and experience. My emphasis there is very much don't just see that as a matter of mapping and survey, important though that is, that they are building up local relationships, finding out what works, who is a really good interpreter. And this might be one of the reasons they stick with Karma Paul for so many years. Subsequently, the interpreter's clearly a very particular role. He wasn't the only one, but they are really enacting this role of intermediary with the various groups locally and across the whole region. So they're in a very particular position. So yes, a lot of knowledge is built up very, very quickly. A lot of it is still in the archives here. And that's why they plan very explicitly a series of expeditions. There's also a financial side to that, where you're promoting one expedition, you're selling your books, you're showing your films to raise funds for the next one. This is not an unfamiliar story in terms of expeditions more recently.
You mentioned the archive. I must ask you, what's in the archive that you would like to see, each of you, and talk about the German archive as well, Atem as well, because it's fascinating to see the difference. What are we seeing in the exhibition that you think is particularly instructive? And what else is there that is being hidden away at the moment that you'd like perhaps to see, your favourite pieces?
I mean, I have too many favourites. But off the top of my head, a favourite piece, because it is a very spectacular little object, is the Tara, the little bronze statue that is presented by the Chief Lama at Rongbuk to General Bruce. And he gets, when Bruce describes it, he gets the kind of Tara wrong, and that's an interesting story, which I could tell another time.
No,
but
tell us now. Tell us.
Well,
tell us more about the artifact and why it was presented.
Okay, so the artifact's a little bronze Tara. It's an important object for the Lamas, and they present it. It's a very significant object they present as a gift to the climbers. And when Bruce writes up the expedition, he describes it as a green Tara, which, according to the iconography, represents bravery or readiness to courage, if you like. And Bruce clearly liked that idea, but unfortunately it was a white Tara, which represents compassion and all-seeing compassion at that. So the white Tara has eyes, 7 eyes, and hands, the palms, the head. And it's significant to know because I think the film from 1922 shows, in fact, the handing over of this Tara from the Lama to the climbers. And the film presents it as happening on the way up the mountain. But what we know from Bruce's account, and from another account by the head Lama, in fact, is that it was given on the way down after the avalanche. So these differences between the symbolism of the white and the green Tara suddenly take on a whole different meaning. And seeing the little Tara there, it's quite moving, really, to see it in the exhibition. So that is my favorite little object. I think it has recently been to the United States. It's quite a well-traveled Tara, and it's well worth thinking about what that represents in terms of this gift and what it meant to the people there at that scene that you can see on the film.
How difficult must it have been then, with so much in the collection here, to have chosen what to actually put in and what to leave out?
Well, I don't envy the curators of the exhibition. We should say that Caitlin, the media officer here, was involved in this, but the design agency Event have designed the exhibition, and they've created this narrative, and they've had a wonderful experience working across all the collections and making a selection as they have. It is very much a small selection, but it's very significant. There's very well chosen items there. So they've chosen the items in a certain way to tell a story around the making of the film, both locally, the way the script was written, the way the film physically was put together, the footage, the way the horses carried the equipment, all the infrastructure necessary to get this film made in the way that it was extraordinarily. This is the highest anyone has ever filmed before. It's the first time you've filmed in Tibet. It's an incredible film, and at that time in the 1920s, filmmaking of this kind is very new, and filmmakers are experimenting in extreme environments, including in the Amazon, for example. And so it is an utterly compelling record, and the curators and organizers of the exhibition have chosen to make the film central to their story, partly because of the processes of making it, but then also the impact it has on the image of Everest and in particular of Tibet on the public. So there's a story about the distribution of the film, the promotion of the film subsequently. So I think it was a very good choice, and that they brought things out that really weren't known before, have been worked on recently, I should say, by Jan Fall, a PhD student who's lectured to the Society recently about film.
What about you, Jonathan? What strikes you? What's most
In the
pertinent,
collection?
perhaps, to your interests?
Well, some of the most interesting files I think I've seen recently are the files relating to people who applied to go on the expeditions but were rejected. And that's like a real cross-section of, kind of wannabe mountaineers in the early part of the 20th century. It's fascinating. And there's also other files which were people who were considered potentially for the expeditions, but were rejected. And you start to begin to understand through these files the kind of hierarchical assumptions and elite kind of class-based assumptions around selection for these expeditions. So, if you had a military career, or that was very definite, or you'd been to Oxford and Cambridge, you definitely had, you're on the top of the ladder in terms of selection. A lot of regional mountaineers with, very strong climbing experience, like Colin Kirkus or Marco Pallis, applied to go on the expeditions in the 1930s, and they didn't make the cut over, some, quite, B-list kind of military types. So you do wonder about some of the decision-making going on, as part of the Mount Everest Committee. So.
And if you're a woman, no chance.
Well, that's really interesting. There's evidence in there of one woman who did apply to go on the Mount Everest expeditions.
Do you remember her name? Can we give her a name?
No, I can't. I'm sorry.
We'll have to look her up.
That's my bad.
No, not at all. I've sprung that on you.
But also, now, who was it? It was Odell, I think. There's correspondence from Odell when he was invited to go in the 30s on an Everest expedition, and he said, I can't do it because of the pain I put my wife through last time, but I will go if she can come as well. So there was obviously some discussion there around, and of course that didn't happen.
No. And do we know whether she was keen to go?
I think if I remember now, he indicated, they were happy to go together, but he couldn't leave her behind this time. Because I think what had happened before was the news had come out in 24 that somebody had died on Everest, and the Mount Everest Committee did not have next of kin information and wasn't able to inform next of kin quickly. And so she spent several days thinking that her husband had died. So,
Gosh.
Yeah.
But, when you mentioned Marco Pallis, he, despite not being a part of the Everest expeditions, he did climb a lot in the Himalayas, and he talks about also of kind of trying other ethnic communities, in not only the Sherpas as well. And he writes a lot in the newspapers about other communities. But to the point of, I think, women in expeditions, I would say in the 30s, in the German expeditions, we have instance of 2 times. 32, you have this journalist called Elizabeth Knowlton, who goes up to Nanga Parbat, but she stays mostly in the base camp and walks around a bit, but I don't think she goes high up.
Skirts.
I think she would be with skirts. And there's Hetty Dierenfurth, who was also in the German expeditions later on, and I think she makes the record for climbing the highest for a woman in 34 34 or 32, one of those things.
So were the German expeditions more open to the idea of women taking part than the British ones?
I would say they were smart about taking women, because first Knowlton came as a journalist for the New York Times, and that's how they kind of funded that expedition. And Hetty Derenford was the wife of Günther Oskar Derenford, and that's how they got to the mountains. But of women in the mountains, I think in the 19th century you have Fanny Workman Bullock, who's trying to climb in the Himalayas as well. Yeah.
Tell us about the difference between the German archive and the archive here. Have you had much chance to sort of compare and contrast them?
I did get a good look at the collection here through the Wiley Digital Fellowship as well. In terms of kind of materials from the porters themselves, there are few in both, but there are more correspondences in the German archive that I've been able to find. But within the RGS collection itself, there's this letter that Charles Bruce, he writes to Karma Paul, the interpreter, and he writes it in Nepali. And he's telling Karma Paul that he will send a copy of the 1922 book, and he's asking about a particular porter who was sick and asking if he is well, and to send him that he's praying for him and for his recovery. So,
but to see it written in Nepali is rather special. What about Tibet, India, Nepal? How much of an archive do each of those countries have regarding these early expeditions? Or is it all sort of whisked away?
Well, you have some Tibetan materials in collections like this. I mean, you have the Tara, you have some Tibetan documents, you have passports. So I'm very interested to hear this Nepali letter. I have to find the reference for it later on.
I'll send it to you.
So there's a lot of materials. There are some materials written or presented by Tibetans, but most of this, it's an international archive. There's material in Italy and Germany and presumably in Switzerland. You may know about of climbers going into Tibet when they're able to. Can I just make a side point about Marco Pallis? Because it seems to me this question of Tibet that you've raised raises an issue about the interest of the climbers in Tibetan Buddhism, for example. And Marco Pallis is really interesting. I just have to say that I was lucky enough to meet him in the early 1980s. And he went on to write a book called Peaks and Lamas, and it reflected his later development of interest in Buddhism. But even the climbers in 22 were clearly, some of them trying to grapple with what they were seeing and what they were experiencing. And some of them, like Howard Somerville, as you will know, got very interested in Tibetan music. And some of that is reflected in the exhibition here. Now, I'm not suggesting this was in any way expertise, but it is interesting to think of this expedition as another moment in the developing British knowledge of Tibet, which after all had been given a huge push by the military invasion of Tibet in 20 years earlier. That invasion brought back with it hundreds of manuscripts and other aspects of Tibetan material culture that then found their way into libraries and museums in Britain and are still being worked on today. So that is not true of the Everest expeditions. They brought back some small things. But in the larger context of expeditions into Tibet, they sometimes had that effect. And it's obviously an indirect effect that they've stimulated scholarship and interest in Tibetan Buddhism.
What's the legacy of these expeditions? I wonder if you could talk to us about that really, and how do we still see what happened in these early expeditions influencing mountaineering, particularly on Everest, to this day?
I think Everest has become prestige, the ultimate in prestige goods, hasn't it? In a kind of globalized adventure tourism, you know, and it's these expeditions kick off that kind of global fascination. With Everest, you know, it's an object of kind of nationalistic obsession. You know, there are, we mustn't forget, it sits on an international border, you know, it's a geopolitical kind of fracture zone, you know, we've got Chinese-occupied Tibet to the north, we've got Nepal to the south, which is a, you know, low middle-income country, it's high on the Fragile State Index, you know, it has had all kinds of problems, you know, with kind of political insurgency and, you know, natural disasters, so, and yet still, you know, there is this global focus on getting to the top of Everest, you know, at any cost, for any amount of money. You know, it's a huge industry these days. So, and, you know, I mean, I talked about the research network I'm part of. You know, we're trying to understand at the moment how, you know, historically that's come about and how it's perpetuated as well, and whether some of those colonial era legacies are still very apparent on the mountain. So, for instance, you know, we know that there's lots of ethnic groups in Nepal, but when Western clients go to climb Everest, they want to climb with a Sherpa. So lots of other ethnic groups pass as Sherpa, you know, so there might be Rai or Limbu or Gurung or something like that, but they will pass as Sherpa because that's what Western clients want to experience as part of their adventure tourism package. So, but that's fundamentally, you know, kind of, that's highly problematic. And we're seeing, you know, Everest is changing so rapidly. You know, we've got lots of Nepali-led contractors now, and, you know, a lot more assertive, younger kind of Nepalese contractors working on the mountain.
So their agency has improved. It's more democratic, is it, would you say, Atem, these days? Or maybe not as much as you might want to see, but better than it was? Or am I being wishful?
I mean, I think they still have problems with how much they're compensated when any accidents happen. And also, to go to Jonathan's point about equating high-altitude work with the Sherpas, it's an entire community of people, an ethnic group, and to think of always when you talk about Sherpas, the first thing that comes to your head is mountaineering or mountain work. But they're a very diverse group, and they're involved in different trades as well. And the appropriation of the word Sherpa as well for different, I mean, I think they use this word in a lot of international kind of diplomatic conferences. There's a term called the Sherpa who's made to kind of talk between different parties. So the appropriation of the term Sherpa as well, and equating that term, like that particular community, to just that specific work.
What extra attention are these histories going to get, do you think, when we approach 2024, which will be the centenary of the expedition in which Mallory and Irvine died?
A lot, I think, it's going to happen. So this is particularly good that we're having this discussion now, and we're having an exhibition which is foregrounding this experience a little bit earlier, so that a broader context can be given, and we can see that history and that heritage in other ways from the ways that we've seen it before. I mean, my answer about the significance today, we've heard some very interesting comments in terms of mountaineering and Sherpa heritage. I think my answer would be very much about the collections here, which I think are collections of relating to world culture and society and environment. I think this is a collection that is very fortunately in the RGS, but is really a collection for the world, and making it available to as wide as possible users, seeing it with new eyes, thinking about this archive in terms of climate change, in terms of heritage, in terms of people's relationship to nature. All of these things are really possible and necessary. And we hope that, you know, I hope that some of the archive materials you see out there, or some of the things you've heard here, might stimulate new ways of thinking about these amazing collections. And on the point of making them available, well, clearly the RGS has been involved in digitizing a lot of material that is now much more widely available than it was. And I would like to say that the films that the RGS owns in their collection have all been digitized. That in the UK, you can see all of them on the BFI player. If you just search for the BFI player, you will see that all the films, with one exception, which is about to appear, which is the 1924 film. The BFI are going to put that one up in its original state, not its restored stage. So there's a real effort to make this available, and I think I would also like to thank Caitlin Watson, who was involved in organising the exhibition and making it possible for the Society. But what people make of it, you must go and see and have your own thoughts.
Well, what efforts are being made during these centenary years to hear contemporary perspectives from the Everest region, rather than us sitting here in London talking about it?
Certainly there's new material coming out at the moment. So there's a new book called Sherpa by a couple of Nepalese journalists, Pradeep Bashal and Ankit Adhikari. And they've, during COVID, a lot of high altitude workers couldn't work. They were at home. And so they traveled around Nepal and interviewed a lot of Sherpa guides and asking them about their perspectives on the mountains, stuff like that, wanted to find out about their histories. So there's new material coming out at the moment. I think there will be, as part of our research network, there'll be events going on. We're working with the Kendal Mountain Festival to program kind of roundtable discussions and arts programming around the centenary, particularly in 2024. I know that, Merton College, Oxford, which is Sandy Irving's old college, and Magdalen College, Cambridge, which is Mallory's college, they're going to be putting on events and they're going to be having kind of reciprocal talks and lectures, and we've been in discussion with them about, how we can include more contemporary voices from the Greater Himalaya region, stuff like that. So.
I think there's an opportunity here for the RGS. I think if you look at museum collections in all over the world, really, but including in Britain, that relate to world cultures, these museums in Oxford and Cambridge and London and elsewhere are bringing in people, artists, members of communities from far afield, or sometimes from the diasporic populations who live in London. The RGS has done this before, 10, 15 years ago, in relation to its collections. And there are really exciting possibilities here to partner with organizations that may be based in South Asia, or may in fact be based in Europe, to generate new ways of thinking about these collections and to add to the archive. This is not just a closed, finished thing, this archive. It is actually an organic thing that can be added to, can be amended, can be expanded to include aspects of the experience of individuals whose experience hasn't been, made prominent before.
If you have one wish each from these centenary events to reshape our thinking about these expeditions, what would it be, Atem?
Off the top of my head, I guess it would be to take some of the collection back to Darjeeling, maybe. That's where most of the porters were recruited from. That's where that was the starting point of the expedition. I think it would be to take it back to Darjeeling and have a more public exhibition of the photographs or the film for the people to see these materials, because I think most of them haven't seen these photographs or haven't seen these films or don't have access to these materials.
Are there people still involved in mountaineering on Everest who can trace family connections back to these early expeditions?
There are descendants still living in Darjeeling. So after independence, the kind of center shifted back to Nepal. So, but you still have descendants from the early expeditions. Some families are still there in India, in Darjeeling.
What would your wish be, Jonathan? Because at the beginning you talked about you're looking at what's omitted quite often in some of the archives, the records that you're looking into with your other Everest projects.
Yeah. So I'm currently researching the history of Charles Howard Bury's archive. He was the leader of the 21 Reconnaissance expedition. He was from the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. And in the 1980s, a lot of his collection was sold off and went into private hands. Some of it's now in the public archives in Westmeath. But I'd dearly like to find out where a lot of it is. We're having to trace it through catalogues from house sales and things like that. And I'd like to see some of this material come back into the public domain and be accessible. So.
What in particular appeals to you about that? Just because it's been hidden away for so long?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, you know, the historian in you always wants to find kind of new primary sources. I think he had an extraordinary life, which is only really, we're just finding out about at the moment. You know, he lived in North Africa for quite a while. He was gay. He had a long-term partner, male partner, and of course, none of these stories normally comes out in the normal stories you hear about Everest. And he was an extraordinary photographer as well. And so, for me, what I would really like to see is that, you know, our ability to particularly interpret photographic collections in different archives and put all that material together. That would be extraordinarily powerful as a research tool, I think.
There's no end to it, is there?
Yeah.
It'll keep you busy to the rest of your career.
Absolutely, yeah.
Felix?
Well, I mean, this event is great. I think I would like more events like this where we're getting people working on the archive, coming into the collection with new questions and finding new things. You know, really, if we don't ask those questions and we don't look, and we just look for the same thing that we saw before, that's what we'll see. But I think the collection can reveal lots of other things, and work like Atem and Jonathan are doing is revealing that. I'm also interested in, Martine, in what you said about family histories and generations, because Atem will know, because she kindly tried to find some descendants of Karma Paul, the interpreter, and his daughters, I think, died maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So it is possible that there may be oral histories of family members still to be available, but I think bringing in those perspectives, perhaps of successive generations, but just new perspectives on these collections is really the way to go. And they will show us that actually these anniversary moments are moments when we can rethink these histories and do some really interesting things.
Thank you very much. Shall we have some questions from other people now, instead of just me? If you've got a question, I think we've got some microphones, so you don't have to shout. Yes, here's Mitchell with the microphone. Let me start with one from our online audience. Do we know, with later expeditions, maybe those in the 50s, for example, were similar numbers of Sherpas used as in the early ones?
In terms of numbers, I mean, they would be recruited from Kathmandu itself. So it could be more, I would think, later in the 50s.
Could be more later on. Is that a function of having more money to spend on it?
Good question. It's, you know, I mean, 53 was incredibly ambitious, and logistically, you know, it was an enormous project. So I don't know honestly, you know, in terms of total numbers, whether there were more labourers. But yeah, certainly 53 was a big operation.
Yeah,
so.
huge. Have we got any questions in here? Or you're being shy?
Very shy.
You're being shy. Thankfully, other people online are helping us out. Great to hear there are more materials than just in the RGS archives. Are there more open access archives that we can visit to see items from Everest? How is it, for example, to access the German Alpine Club archive?
The catalogs are online. A lot of the photographs are also online. So they're available.
So where would you start? Because I sometimes try to find stuff in the, in the RGS archive, and there's so much of it, you almost don't know where to begin. So are there sort of key words that you should start to sort of look at if you want to look things up online, as opposed to sort of see them in real life? Because you can come in and ask, if you're a member, you can come in and request from Alistair MacLeod, the curator, the keeper of the collection, to see these things. And they are amazing to get your hands on them carefully in white gloves. Where would you start?
Well, there is, of course, an online catalogue. But my suggestion would be, if you've not used catalogues before, the best place to start would be in the full reading room talking to the staff, because then you will get advice on how to search effectively. There are some resources online that will help you with the RGS catalogue, which is very powerful once you know your way around it. There are also catalogue materials around some of the, literally the manuscript archive, which were digitized a number of years ago and are available through the National Archives. That is the catalogue to the RGS collection. But again, you know, if you're not used to using catalogues, these can be quite perplexing. And so it's helpful to have an introduction to them if you're seriously looking for something specific. You could hit lucky straight away, but you're likely to need some help.
Yeah, and there are opportunities to come in and be shown the ropes, aren't there, in the reading room. Oh, crikey, here we go. What name should we use to refer to Everest? This week it has been announced that Snowdon will be known by its Welsh name. Is it time for the Tibetan name, Chomolungma?
Chomolungma.
Say it again.
Chomolungma.
Chomolungma. Doesn't look like that on here. To enter the public lexicon. Thank you. Thank goodness you're here, Atem.
Can I just chip in? Because these two will answer that intelligently. But I mean, in terms of, just to say, historical context, that question has been asked for about 150 years, so it's not a new question. But there are clearly different answers to it at different times. Over to you two.
It's a highly politicized question as well. So the, Chinese Communist Party wants everybody to refer to Everest as Chomolungma. In the 1930s, I think it was, in Nepal, they realized that they didn't have a name for the mountain, so they came up with the name Sagarmatha. Yeah. I mean, there's an academic in Australia called Ruth Gamble who's writing a piece at the moment about Chomolungma, who was a goddess, as I understand it, in the region, in the Rongbuk region, north of Everest. So that's the origin of that name, as I understand it. But as Felix said, this has been, a hot potato political cartographic, for a very, very long time. So, there are all kinds of problems in fixing on something, that would keep everybody happy, I think.
Atem, what do you think?
I agree with what Johnson says. It's a highly politicized topic. And, I mean, Everest itself has three phases. I mean, one from the Chinese side, Tibetan side, and the Nepalese side as well.
The other question here is, did the Royal Geographical Society coin the name Mount Everest? Everest was a surveyor's name, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Where did that? Who decided on that? To give it the name Everest?
The British.
Colonial powers,
yes,
rather than the RGS specifically. Yeah, okay. Have comparisons been made to between early survey images and those that we have today, just to see the difference and the accuracy?
Survey images of
the mountain.
There has been, I think, some work on these panoramas. Remember that the photographs that were taken did all kinds of things at all kinds of scales and in all kinds of forms. You have vast panoramas, you have tiny pictures, you have lantern slides, you have moving film. And amongst them were these incredible panoramas that were made. And I believe there has been a project to compare and contrast with contemporary photography. Alistair MacLeod has talked about that. So if anybody's interested, he can provide more information on
It'd
that.
be particularly useful for climate change purposes, won't it, as well?
Mm.
Can you say anything more about the scientific equipment that was taken on these earlier expeditions? What were they trying to measure? What were they doing?
Well, they're taking equipment to survey. A lot of plane tabling went on. They're taking a lot of cameras, which in the way they're conceiving the camera is, of course, a piece of scientific equipment, and a lot of different kinds of cameras, and specially adapted zoom lenses and so on.
We saw some of those in the pictures with Noel, didn't we? Because somebody asked you about that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is a mountaineering expedition, but as with the polar expeditions of Scott, etc., they are doing some collecting, they're doing some science, they're collecting botany and geology. I think there are 1 or 2 geology specimens maybe downstairs. But the principal aim is to map the route to Everest and to document the journey. So I think that it's a very interesting question from the point of view of logistics. I mean, people have not looked at this archive. They've obviously looked for the people, they've looked for certain kinds of images, but they haven't until recently said, let's go and find where there are lots of crates in photographs or evidence of the infrastructure of an expedition. And once you start to do that, you see actually a lot of visual evidence as well as other kinds of evidence of the equipment that they took with them. And it is a very good question because, you know, you needed certain equipment to stay alive at high altitude, but just provisioning an expedition of this scale was a big enterprise. And that's why the transport officers were really crucial. And Morris was a transport officer, he said. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the points that Jonathan has made to me before is about the proximity of that role to supply and to employment and so on. So it's not unusual to find it's those people who give us some really interesting evidence about that side of expeditions. Yeah.
This is pertinent to what we were talking about before we came in here, Felix. There's often described a heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Is there a similar age for Everest expeditions? Or I suppose you were saying earlier that in one sense they followed on from each other, didn't they?
Very much so, yeah. Logistically, I think they talked about the polar method of doing an expedition, a series of camps and supply, the logistics of supply. But it's not just at that level, it's also at the level of the filming, because as we know, Noel was very influenced by Ponting. And so there's a direct relationship to what he's trying to do and what has been done in the poles. So I suppose, is there a heroic era in huge number of inverted commas? Yes, this is it, the 1920s. Although, ironically, it's really 1953, isn't it, that should be seen together. Perhaps we're dealing with a whole history that goes from 22 to 53, but there's an awful lot of failure in there as well.
Yeah.
There was a question from the floor,
Sorry.
by the way.
Would you like the microphone? We would like you to have the microphone. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I was going to say how much work has been done on the camera technology and equipment and how that evolved during the different expeditions. Felix sort of partly answered that, but I'm personally fascinated by that element.
I think I would refer you to Jan Fall, who's just done a PhD just on the film, and she's taken the 22 to 53 period as a whole. And part of that is about distribution and what's in the film, but also the making and processing of the film material. The cameras, we know they were Newton Sinclair cameras. They were used in promotion of Newton Sinclair cameras, unsurprisingly. So there's a history of sponsorship here as well. All kinds of companies sponsoring the expeditions. And typewriters, they have a number of typewriters, not just one. And you see photographs of them using the typewriter. So Remington sponsor the expedition, and there are letters from them in the archive. I'm sure he didn't quite mean typewriters, but I mean, there are lots of different kinds of equipment, and I think Jan Fall is the person who's written most about the moving film associated with the expeditions. The photography, I mean, has there been work done on the technical side, would you say?
I'm not sure. They were using stereophotogrammetry on the survey. is my understanding as well, which was pretty advanced at the time. So I'm no expert, though.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, Hincks was very interested. That was his thing. He was very, very interested in that, and that was what differentiated these expeditions in his mind. He's the secretary of the RGS. The RGS are working with the Alpine Club together. They're supporting these expeditions, but Hincks was very interested in the photogrammetry, and you know, it was the marker of a scientific RGS expedition for him, as opposed to a sort of popular expedition.
Do we know how much they spent on the first expedition in 1921? Don't worry if you don't know. It is a very specific question.
A bit. We know much more about 22 and 24, and they were expensive, you know. And Noel himself put a lot of money into the expedition, which is why he got the rights to do what he did. A lot of accounts, there's a large amount of financial information about all the expeditions. Nobody has gone through it with a fine-tooth comb, but people have pulled out information about the financing. So again, it's a matter of reading the material that's been written, but actually new work could be done on the financial side.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening. There's lots of echoes from the 1920 expeditions that we still see today. I was thinking about the 2014 avalanche and the disaster that happened there, and how many Sherpa died as a result of that. Do you think the quest for Everest and the commercialisation of Everest has worked to maintain the caste system, the hierarchy that exists within Everest, and the porters and others who work on the mountain from local countries?
Well, there's certainly still huge inequalities, you know, and, you know, there are quasi-colonial kind of modes of production and, you know, labour hierarchies. You know, a lot of wealth is extracted from the mountain and Nepal and goes overseas. Things are changing, as we said. You know, there are Nepalese contractors, you know, but it's so it's a, you know, it's a rapidly changing picture on Everest, I think. You know, it's complicated by climate change. You know, there are predictions that, you know, within 10 years, Everest may become unclimbable because of instability in the Khumbu icefall. You know, that's a fairly shocking... I think there was a piece of research that came out recently that said 2,000 years of ice accumulation on Everest has been lost since 1990. And we already know the Khumbu is a very dangerous place to work. Most people who die on the mountain are high-altitude workers from the Sherpa and other ethnic communities. That's only going to become more dangerous. I don't know whether you've seen the documentary Aftershock on Netflix, you know, but there's some pretty horrendous footage in there of that kind of environment going up through the Khumbu icefall. You know, I can't see any indication that there's going to be more regulation or self-regulation on the mountain. The Nepalese Ministry of Tourism makes an awful lot of money from issuing licenses for people to go and climb on Everest. You know, it's a real cash cow.
Yeah, definitely. With climate change, the work is becoming more dangerous, and I don't see anything changing in terms of what the Nepalese government would do. I was just thinking also about the perseverance of this, you know, kind of the image of the Sherpa also working in the mountains, and, you know, the attributes that are given to them. And I was just remembering this particular documentary where Sherpas are actually taken to Norway to build a particular hiking trail. So, you know, that still happens.
Do we know how many people it takes to mount an exhibition now compared with then?
And the nature of expeditions has changed. You know, these
Depends how
big...
much you pay, probably, doesn't it?
You know, I mean, what we see now on Everest is mostly commercial adventure tourists. You know, they're quite often they don't have a lot of mountaineering experience. Sometimes they have none at all. You know, can't put their own crampons on. You know, they still use fixed ropes. You know, so it's a very kind of labour-intensive way of getting up a mountain. It's very different from other forms of alpine mountaineering. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that there's also resistance against guideless climbing in Everest. So it would be difficult for any, say, a Western mountaineer to go up to try to climb Everest alone by himself without...
I think that's eminently sensible, don't you?
Well, there's a system, you know, that kind of everybody abides by. And certainly at the moment, what's happening is lots of these new entrants into the market are trying to apply the same system to other 8,000 meter peaks in the Himalayas, you know, on the south face of Choyoyo and on Manaslu as well, with you know, mixed results at the moment. So, but they're trying to replicate that business model on other 8,000 meter peaks. You know, they tried to do it on K2 this year as well. You know, there were pictures of immense queues on K2, which were absolutely terrifying. Goodness only knows how, you know, more people didn't die. So it's a kind of out-of-control business model. We've got a colleague in the network who describes Everest as a brutal capitalist deathscape because death, and particularly of high-altitude workers, is baked into the financial equation. Make no mistake about it, you know, people will die because of our Western obsession with getting to the top of Everest. So, and quite often they'll be, you know, from indigenous workers. Yeah.
A couple of things. Just, did the team in 1921, the reconnaissance expedition, did they expect to even attempt the summit?
I don't think so.
No, just reconnaissance, just, she says. We mentioned Sherpa by Adhikari. Is that another, are there any other first-hand accounts of Sherpa life and culture that you would recommend?
I mean, there are these two autobiographies of Tenzin Norgay and Ang Tharke. And I think Sherry Ortner's book on the Sherpas is really interesting.
Right, okay, thank you.
And Tarke's autobiography is a fascinating document. Yeah, it was published first in French, and it's been translated into English now. Yeah, it's a really important book.
I think we may have answered this already, but it's worth stressing. How does the RGS intend to broaden access to archive materials beyond academia? Well, if you are a member here, you can go and access it, can't you? If you can make requests to see artifacts.
You could, yes, you can. It's free to access if you are a member. Also, there's been a lot of digitization gone on, and you can see that on site freely here, but you have to be here to see that. And yeah, that's basically the way to do it.
One of my favourite things that I always like to see is when Hilary was planning his expedition. I think it was Burberry made some of the kit, and he drew a picture of the shape of the sock that he wanted, and it is literally that on a piece of paper and given to Burberry. And they made him some socks from it, which is just so incredibly rudimentary. It's almost like you can't, well, just a sock. I need a sock. Sorry, did you want to ask a question?
I have a question. Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. So my question is, so we have now 100 years history for exploring Everest from 1920s. Now we are 2020s. So going forward, I believe in the next 100 years, there will be still many people, either individuals or organizations going there, either for exploration or for other purpose. So my question is, what do you think are the most important things that we can learn from history that for those people going forward and in your mind, because you are studying this field for many years, so I'm interested to understand this, what we can learn from history.
Atem?
That there was a mountain that was that high, because I don't know, 100 years from now, what would happen to the height of Everest with all the snow melting. But yeah, just to remember that the mountain was there and what we did to kind of save the climate, the world there.
It needs to be protected.
Absolutely. Talking with a colleague recently who did some ethnographic research on 8,000 meter peaks with indigenous high-altitude workers, and he said one of their key complaints, he said, was that they do not get recognition from Western clients, and that their role in climbing Everest historically has not been recognized. And I think if there's one thing we can do, you know, is to address that, you know, so when Western tourists go there, they don't name their Sherpa guide in their Instagram post or something like that. You know, that kind of erasure of the indigenous contribution is something that really has to change. So.
Yeah, and I think also, as well as that, it's the stories of different members of an expedition. If anyone's been on expeditions, you will know there are many stories told by different members of the expedition, whether it's the shoemaker or the cook. And so it's trying to grasp that. And if we're going on expeditions now, it's thinking about how those stories and those interests are protected in the conduct of an expedition. And I think that might be one of the lessons from this as well.
If you haven't noticed, Everest is looking down on us right here. Third panel from the left in gold. That's it for this evening. Thank you very much indeed to our panellists, Felix, Jonathan and Atem. Fascinating to hear your perspectives on Everest from a very different viewpoint. Thank you for attending here in person and also online, and we hope to see you back here very soon. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.